We'll be addressing a fundamental aspect of creating a truly inclusive digital world. Please welcome Anisat, who will be presenting on building an accessible web from the ground up, essential practices for inclusive design. So you are welcome. I stop sharing so you can share your screen.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
Thank you. So hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Anisat Ahmed, and I'm so excited to be talking about a very important topic, which is building an accessible web from the ground up, the essential practices for inclusive design and development. So in this topic today, we are going to be exploring how to integrate accessibility into design and development process from the very beginning. Um, so a little bit introduction about myself. I'm Anisat Ahmed and I am a front-end developer and also an accessibility advocate and also a Google Women Tech Makers ambassador. So today, this topic is going to cover why accessibility matters, the key principles of accessible web design and development, common mistakes and how to avoid them, tools and resources that we can, always fall back to when it comes to testing for accessibility, and also actionable steps that you can take today to incorporate or integrate accessibility into your design and development. So, no matter your experience level, you're going to leave here with actionable insights as to how to make the web more inclusive for everyone. So I will start with why accessibility matters, right? What exactly is accessibility? So for my audience who are just new to what accessibility is in web, it is about ensuring everyone, including people with disabilities, ensuring that they can perceive, understand, navigate, and also interact with the web. And why is it important to ensure accessibility into our web projects? Number one reason is due to complying to legal standards, legal laws, because there are in so many countries there are laws that are required to be followed to ensure that accessibility is put into place when designing, tools and technologies or web or software products. And the first standard or guideline is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline called the WCAG. There are set of guidelines that are put into place as to ensuring certain components or aspects of web projects are accessible. And then here in the United States, we have the American with Disability Act. It's called the ADA, and also this Section 508 standard to ensure IT products and services are made accessible. In the Europe, it's called the European Accessibility Act, called the EAA, and also EN 301549 standards for ensuring digital accessibility. So there are, as you can see from this, there are a series of standards and laws that are required for us to comply with to ensure that accessibility is put into place for everyone. And then another reason why accessibility is important because it helps to expand our audience. We're not just building for people who are not with disabilities, but we're also including people are who have disabilities so they can all have equal access to using our products or web or sites or technologies or tools and the likes. We're also improving SEO because when a web project is accessible, it ranks high in the search engine optimization, and so thereby when your products are or your web projects are made accessible, you are improving your SEO, and also you are boosting your brand reputation. So for example, if a brand is well known for ensuring accessibility, for creating digital inclusion for all their users regardless of their regardless um it helps boost their brand reputation. So that's another reason why accessibility is important. And the most important reason of all is human impact. You're making an impact when your projects are accessible to everybody. So imagine, for instance, a user who has low vision or is visually impaired. They can, if they can easily access your website because you've made it accessible from the very beginning, that's a huge significant impact you've made. You do not just block them off from accessing very important information you've placed on your website, right? You've really made a huge impact when your project is already accessible from the very beginning. So these are some of the very key important reasons why accessibility is very crucial. And there are key principles of accessible web design and development. And these principles are called the POUR principles. POUR principles, the POUR principles. And P standing for perceivable, O standing for operable, U standing for understandable, and R standing for robust. So what does this mean? These principles are principles that guide how content should be made accessible, right? So when your content is perceivable, you're ensuring that you've provided alternative formats for users who are, say, for instance, who have low visual impairment. When you provide text alternative for non-text content, say, for instance, when you put up images on your website, does your images have alternative text that screen readers can use to read text back to users who have low or who have low vision or are visually impaired? Or does your videos or audios have proper captions before you put them out there? These are providing alternative text formats for non-text content. So when you do this, you are making your content perceivable to diverse users. And another example is ensuring sufficient color contrast. We don't want to put a light text on a light background or a dark text on a dark background. That way your users will not be able to perceive the information you've put out there. You want to ensure that there's a distinct difference between your text and your background. So when you ensure sufficient color contrast, you are also making your content perceivable to as many users as possible. Operable in the sense that can your users navigate easily and interact easily with your web project? um for instance, how can you make them operable? Do you provide navigation, keyboard navigation for your website? Hope your website is not just the site that can be navigable through just mouse alone. You provided keyboard navigation support. Another thing to also consider when making operable is sense that hope the animation on your website are not something that can trigger seizures for users who have seizure disabilities, because according to accessibility standard, when animations flash more than 3 times per second, that can really trigger seizures for users who have seizure disability. So that way your site is not really operable to users with diverse needs. So another under the POUR principle is understandable, which is the U for standing for understandable. Are your content easy to read and understand? Is it easy to understand your content? Do they have proper logical structure? It's not like having paragraphs for headings for paragraphs, things like that. Your content having clear, simple language? Can your users really understand this content you've put up on your website without them having to, like, say, for instance, open up a dictionary to try to understand the content of your website? Or do your fonts, the fonts you use on your website, are they readable enough? Things like that are what is considered when following the understandable part of the principle. The next one is robust. Your website should be able to work across different devices or assistive technology. So when I say assistive technology, I mentioned earlier screen readers. These are an example is a screen reader. In Mac, for example, we have the voiceover. That is one of the inbuilt assistive technologies that users who have low vision or are visually impaired try to use to navigate websites or things like that. And Does your site works well across several devices, mobile devices, tablets, desktops, things like that? So there are things to be considered when implementing robust content for your web, using proper semantic HTML or ARIA for dynamic content. So when I mean dynamic content, for example, a modal or a dialog box, for example. So now, going deep dive into what we are going to be talking about today, is, we talked about essential practice. The topic is about essential practices for design and development, right? So what are the things we need to consider when designing for accessibility? Software or web projects goes through phases. It starts with design, development, and then testing, right? So for design, what are the things you need to consider to start designing accessibility sites or projects? The first thing to consider is the color and the contrast. Designers, use so many beautiful, aesthetically pleasing colors to design projects, right? But when you are trying to consider accessibility, that color palette you've selected for your design projects, is it accessible enough? Is it readable enough to to so many users, right? So there are tools and resources that you can use to check if the selected color palette has sufficient contrast, and I'll be mentioning that later on in the slide. First thing to consider when designing accessibility is to ensure that you have enough contrast for readability. It is very, very important. The next thing to consider is also typography and readability. Font is another amazing way to make your site so beautiful, right? But you don't want to select font that has dancing scripts, right? Because some of those scripted fonts do not are not readable enough for users, for example, who have low vision impairment. So it's very important to use scalable and accessible fonts as much as you can to ensure accessibility right from the design phase of any web project. Another thing to consider is to ensure clear headings and meaningful links. So what do I mean by clear headings? I mentioned earlier not to use paragraphs for headings or headings for paragraphs. There are ways these things are announced to screen readers. So it's always very important to use headings and logical heading structure. You don't want to start with an H3 and then jump to an H1. No, that's not how the heading logic works. Another thing to consider is meaningful links. How meaningful are the links on your design projects? Are you just saying click here or read more? No, they are not meaningful enough. You have to give more context, more short descriptive context to where that link is taking your user to. So, for example, instead of saying read more, you can just say read more about accessibility guideline. That way your user has more context as to where that link on that particular design project is taking them to. So um another thing here is forms and inputs. I've seen so many design projects that are designed with just inputs without the labels, just because the inputs, there's a way they've designed it to just make it look more aesthetically pleasing, but that's actually not a good way to design it, because when you design project like that, that's how your development team will pick it up and develop it. So that way we are not incorporating accessibility from the very beginning. It's always very important to build forms with proper labels when designing. Include the labels when you are designing your forms. That way you're also improving accessibility for your design projects. And another thing to also consider, of all the things I've mentioned when designing for accessibility, is to consider user-centered design and user experience research when designing projects. User-centered design in the sense that you are trying to understand the diverse needs and limitations of potential users of your project. That way, when you design with users in mind, you kind of get a thorough feedback when you conduct research, thorough understanding as to how they would use your website and project. So that way it gives you iterative ideas on how to like improve your design process. So you are also incorporating accessibility from the very very beginning of your project, so which is a good way to start off with accessibility. So next step is to which is after designing, right, is to develop, right, with code. So what do you do when you are developing for accessibility? When you are developing for accessibility, the first step is to use semantic HTML as much as possible. So, for my audience who are just hearing semantic HTML for the first time, semantic HTML are things like when you're building a website or a web project, instead of just using divs to build out your web page, you use you mark them using things like nav for the nav bar section, the main for the main part of your website, your buttons for the buttons, your links for the links. I'm not using divs to build out links or buttons and things like that. So that's semantic HTML. It helps to cut out as many accessibility issues as possible. So when you use semantic HTML, you're really developing towards accessibility. So another thing is to ensure keyboard accessibility. Your users should be able to navigate your site using things like the tab key and enter keys to like navigate site, because there are some users who have mobility impairments, and when your users have mobility impairments, some of them navigate with keyboard. They might not be able to navigate with mouse. So when you provide keyboard navigation support, there's an attribute in HTML that provides that support, which is the tab index. um MDN Web Docs has a very, very detailed explanation as to how to incorporate tab index attributes um, into your HTML code base. So that's another way towards developing for accessibility, providing keyboard navigation support. So another thing is also to um I mentioned earlier, when building interactive elements, like using the button tag in HTML for building buttons and not using divs to build buttons, because those things are not announced properly to screen reader users who are using as this assistive technology to interact with your web elements. So it's very important to avoid using those kind of things when building web projects. Another thing on the list is implement ARIA only when necessary. So ARIA, for my audience learning about ARIA for the first time, ARIA is accessible rich internet application. So there are a set of guidelines that provides like additional context or semantics in HTML. So instead of like I mentioned earlier, buttons, there's the button element, there's the nav element and things like that. But in cases where you're building a modal or a dialog box, for example, there is no HTML tag to talk about modal, right? To code out modal. So most of the time is done using divs to build out this modal. So when you use area attributes to describe this modal, it announces it properly to screen reader users or users with assistive technology. um Yes, so that's how to implement ARIA. So it's very important to implement ARIA only when necessary. You do not want to in bid to make your web projects accessible, you now tend to like create more accessibility issues. So ARIAs are only used when necessary. So that's that about developing for accessibility, because a few small code changes can really make a big difference in accessibility. The next thing here is, which is the main point of this whole presentation, is to like incorporate accessibility from the start. We should have that mind shift of implementing accessibility from the start. Accessibility should not be like an afterthought, because that's one of the biggest mistakes so many teams make. um they tend to treat accessibility as an afterthought. It should not be a last minute fix, because when you incorporate accessibility from the very beginning, you tend to save a lot of time, you tend to save a lot of efforts, especially when you are trying to fix or retrofit fixes after you've even pushed to production, right? So we should have that mind shift from today when we are designing our project. Okay, what are the accessibility checklists I need to follow for me to be able to design an accessible and inclusive web project? As a developer, okay, what's the checklist I need to follow? What are the things I need to follow to develop an accessible web project? It should always be embedded right from the design, development and testing phase, like throughout the development or throughout the life cycle of that project, it should be incorporated, because that way you are saving the team a lot of time and effort. And this approach is usually called the shift left approach. That is incorporating accessibility early enough in the project. So common accessibility mistakes and fixes, I felt like it's also good to point out the common accessibility mistakes so many people do, and what are the kind of fixes that needs to be done. So missing alt text. So when you hear alt text, like I mentioned earlier, I gave an analogy of an image on how images help with making website look good. So when these images are put up, it's always very important to provide alternative text to that image, because this alternative text is what is read to screen reader users. And this is not even just about screen reader users, because there are some instances where the internet might not load the image quickly, but when you provide an alternative text in for that image, it can easily show right at that part of the image, and just you can have an idea of what that image is before the images load up. So it's always good to have alternative text to, like, for your images. Another common mistakes is the low contrast content. There are so many designs out of, oh, the colors blend so well, or the colors look good together. They then have low contrast, which makes it so difficult to, like, read. Even it's not just about users who are visually impaired, but there are people who have low vision and might not be able to see content properly. So when you have low contrast content, it could pose a challenge for your user. I mentioned keyboard navigation support. Like, so many sites do not have proper keyboard navigation for their projects. Another thing is auto playing content that automatically plays. Say for instance, I visit a website and the video put on the site automatically plays. That is not a good one, because it could trigger some things for, like, seizures for users. So what are the fixes that we can do? If your content do not have alternative text today, start adding descriptive alt attributes for your images. Is very, very important. It helps a lot. It really helps a lot. It really helps a lot when it comes to accessibility. And then testing with keyboard only. When you have poor keyboard navigation support, it helps with when it helps to test with only keyboard to ensure that, okay, is my site properly navigable by keyboard. That way you get to know what to do and how to fix it. And then ensuring proper contrast ratios with contents that have low contrast content. So, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there are contrast color contrast checkers that can be used. The most popular one is the Web Aim color contrast checker. They have a good color contrast checker where you can easily test for your foreground color and your background color to check the sufficiency of their contrast. So it's going to tell you if the colors pass the accessibility check or not. So those are tools that one can also use to, like, check for the web content accessibility guideline contrast ratio for colors. Also, provide controls or disable autoplay. So this is for developers. There are ways to disable autoplay in your HTML code. Instead of just adding the autoplay attributes, it's always very important to just remove it completely, because when you set the autoplay attribute to false, it's still not going to read it. And that way, the autoplay, when a video is embedded into your site, it just automatically plays, and that definitely poses an accessibility challenge for users. So it's always good to disable the autoplay and also include controls. There's a control attribute in HTML that you can add to your code base to provide control for your users. That way your users can pause, stop, or play videos that are embedded on the site. So like I said, there's a part of this slide that talks about accessibility testing tools. We talked about keyboard testing with keyboard only here in this slide. That's a very good way to start with manual testing, because here we have manual testing and automated testing. Um, Also testing with screen readers. So, I mentioned Mac has the voice over screen reader. In Windows, we have the NVDA screen reader. So if you're a developer, it's also good to, like, iterate testing with screen readers to see how your site works with the screen reader. So that way, if something does not sound right or doesn't announces anything right, you tend to know how best to fix that. So that way you are, creating a more inclusive web space for your users. I mentioned earlier color contrast checkers, they are very good to determining good color contrast ratios. You don't want to use a yellow text on a white background. That is definitely not a good accessibility color. That is a light yellow color on a white background. That's not good. There are color contrast checkers that you can use to determine, oh, okay, this color I've chosen, do they have like sufficient ratios? So with a color contrast checker, you can easily check for that. Um, for the automated tools, there is a site called Wave, the web accessibility evaluation tool, where you can just put in the URL of your website, and then it's going to check it, analyze it, and give you the output if of certain areas you need to fix for your certain accessibility issues you need to fix for your site. So that's a very, very good tool. It has an extension and it also has a website, so you can either sorry, excuse me, you can either choose to use the extension or the site, the website itself, to test for your accessibility. Another thing is the Ask Dev tool. The Ask Dev tool is very good when it comes to automated testing for accessibility. We also have the Google Lighthouse. The Google Lighthouse is another very good tool incorporated into our Chrome browser extension. So when you click on the inspect, when you right click on your web page and you click on the inspect button, you tend to see where Lighthouse is, and there you can check for your accessibility, um check for test for accessibility for your website. So actionable steps you can take today to ensure accessibility is to make accessibility a habit. One should not see, oh, accessibility as an extra stress or things like that. It is a very, very fundamental aspect of web projects, web development, web design, or any form of, technology or tools we're building and putting out there. It should be embedded in the workflow from the very beginning. It should be embedded in the workflow from the very beginning, right from the design phase to the development phase and down to the quality assurance process. Um, Also, writing accessible documentation for teams and stakeholders will really help, because that way, teams that are not so familiar with the concepts can, have an idea of, okay, where is a good starting point for them to ensure they are doing the right thing when it comes to accessibility. So also being an accessibility advocate within the team is so great, because it really helps champion the cause of inclusive design for all users within the team. And is a great way to push for best practices within the organization. So small consistent action lead to a more inclusive web for everyone. So when we try as much to like be as consistent as possible in incorporating accessibility, the videos we're putting out there, are they properly captioned? The images we're putting out there, do they have alternative text for our users? Things like that. These are small actionable steps that create a more inclusive web for everybody. So what is the key takeaway from this talk is that we should always try, as developers, we can try to test with screen readers, keyboards, to see how well our website work. Another thing is also educate team about accessibility. There are so many resources online that talks about accessibility, from courses to articles to YouTube videos and all of that, to educate our teams about accessibility. And also, we should try as much to follow standard guidelines. The WCAG is a very, very detailed guidelines on things you need to like follow, things you need to incorporate when it comes to enhancing or ensuring accessibility. So to sum this up, accessibility is not just about compliance. It's not about like, oh, just trying to create a better experience for everybody. It's about it's about creating a better experience for everyone. It's an ongoing journey. It's not the one-off thing. It's something that needs to be continuously like incorporated in every single project we put out there. And small changes always definitely make a big impact. So I encourage you all today to start thinking about accessibility early in the project and test your designs, test your development processes, and also make it a habit to consider all users, because that way we are building a more inclusive space for different diverse users. So yes, I would love to hear if you have any questions for me. Thank you so much for listening to this talk today. I hope you've taken a thing or two, and then you start incorporating accessibility. Thank you.